The dry wind carried dust and the scent of distant pine as Jack Wilder rode into Oakhaven, the creak of his saddle a familiar, mournful rhythm. His weathered face was a landscape of quiet sorrow, his deep-set eyes shadowed by a grief that had become as constant as his own breath. Each hoofbeat on the hard-packed earth seemed to echo the emptiness inside him, a silent drum marking the days since Sarah had left him. 2 years had passed, but the ache remained, a heavy stone settled in his chest, making every morning a battle and every sunset a reminder of what was lost. He clutched the reins, his knuckles white, feeling the familiar weight of the silver locket beneath his shirt, pressed against his skin like a brand. It held Sarah's faded tintype, her smile a ghost he carried everywhere. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, baking the wooden storefronts of Oakhaven, casting long, sharp shadows. Jack dismounted in front of Eleanor Vance's general store, tying his bay mare to the hitching post with practiced, unthinking motions. The air here was thick with the smells of horses, stale beer from the saloon across the street, and the lingering wood smoke from the blacksmith's forge. It was a cacophony of life, a stark contrast to the vast, silent plains surrounding his Silent Ridge ranch. He preferred the silence now, the endless, empty horizon that mirrored his soul. Coming into town was a necessary evil, a brief foray into a world he no longer truly belonged to. He wanted only to gather his supplies and retreat to the quiet solitude of his ranch, where memories were his only companions. As he reached for the general store door, a harsh voice, thick with irritation, cut through the din of the street. "Get out of my way, girl. You're always underfoot." Jack paused, his hand still on the brass handle, his gaze drawn to the scene unfolding just outside the store's dusty window. A man, disheveled and gaunt, with an unkempt beard and bloodshot eyes, was roughly pulling a small girl by the arm. This was Thomas Miller. Jack recognized him, a man known more for his patronage of the saloon than for honest work. Thomas's clothes were perpetually dirty, smelling faintly of stale whiskey even from this distance. A nervous twitch pulsed beneath his left eye as he glared down at the child. The girl was tiny, her frame almost swallowed by patched, ill-fitting clothes that hung loosely from her thin shoulders. Her tangled brown hair fell across a face that was smudged with dirt, and her small, fearful hazel eyes darted around, searching for an escape, a kindness, anything but the harsh grip on her arm. She clutched a worn rag doll to her chest, its faded scraps and missing eye a silent testament to countless hours of comfort. Lily Miller, Jack realized. He had heard whispers, the kind that drifted through small towns like Oakhaven, about Thomas taking in his orphaned niece. Whispers that often ended with a shake of the head and a sigh. Thomas gave another sharp tug, making the little girl stumble. A soft, barely audible whimper escaped Lily's lips, quickly stifled, as if she knew better than to make a sound. Jack felt a familiar clenching in his gut, a raw, uncomfortable sensation he had tried to bury deep. He saw the tremble in Lily's small hand as she tightened her hold on her doll, and for a fleeting moment, the image of Sarah, her hand warm and strong in his, flashed through his mind. Sarah had loved children, had dreamed of filling their ranch house with laughter and small, running feet. That dream had died with her, leaving Jack with a void that nothing could fill. He wanted to turn away, to walk into the store and pretend he hadn't seen. His own pain was a heavy enough burden. He had no room for anyone else's sorrow. What good could he do? He was a man, drowning in his own grief, barely keeping his head above the waves. Sarah would have stopped. Sarah would have intervened, her kind heart unable to ignore such blatant neglect. But Sarah was gone. He was not Sarah. He was Jack, a hollowed-out version of the man he once was, a man who had sworn off attachments, sworn off anything that could bring more pain into his already shattered world. Thomas mumbled something Jack couldn't quite make out, his voice a low growl, and then shoved Lily slightly towards the store entrance. Lily stumbled again, her head bowed, her small form seeming to shrink further into itself. Her eyes, however, lifted for a split second, meeting Jack's across the dusty street. There was no accusation, no demand, only a profound, silent fear, a desperate plea for something she couldn't articulate. It was a look that pierced through Jack's carefully constructed indifference, a tiny pinprick in the thick hide of his solitude. He felt the metallic tang of dust on his tongue, and the heat of the sun on his neck suddenly felt oppressive. The scent of stale beer from the saloon seemed to intensify, a bitter reminder of the world Thomas inhabited. Jack watched as Thomas finally released Lily's arm, gesturing for her to follow him, a lazy, dismissive wave of his hand. Lily scurried after him, her small legs struggling to keep pace, her ragdoll still clutched tightly. Jack found himself holding his breath, a tightness in his chest he couldn't quite shake. The sound of their retreating footsteps faded, leaving only the usual town noises, but the scene remained burned behind his eyelids. He finally pushed open the door to the general store, the bell above tinkling a cheerful sound that felt out of place with his mood. Eleanor Vance, her kind face framed by neat gray hair pulled back in a bun, looked up from behind the counter, her spectacles perched on her nose. She offered a small, knowing smile. "Morning, Jack. Just riding in?" "Morning, Eleanor," he replied, his voice a little rougher than he intended. The scent of coffee, dried herbs, and new cloth filled the store, a comforting aroma that usually brought a sense of peace. Today it felt muted, distant. He moved through the aisles, grabbing sacks of flour, coffee beans, salt pork, and a fresh supply of lamp oil. Each item he picked up was a practical necessity for his isolated life, a life where he answered to no one, and no one answered to him. His fingers locked around a tin of dried peaches, feeling the ridged metal. He knew if he let go, he'd drop it. His mind kept replaying the image of Lily's small, fearful face, the way her eyes had met his, a flicker of something so vulnerable it was almost unbearable. He could still hear the rough edge in Thomas's voice, the almost imperceptible whimper from the child. He consciously pushed the thoughts away, telling himself it was none of his business. The world was full of hardship. He had his own, more than enough for a lifetime. He had learned the hard way that caring only led to devastation. He placed his selections on the counter, watching Eleanor tally them with practiced efficiency, her gnarled hands moving swiftly over the ledger. He could feel the warmth of the sun through the front window and the distant murmur of voices from outside. The town felt as indifferent to Lily's plight as he was trying to be. Everyone knew Thomas Miller. Everyone knew of his habits. What could one man do? What could he, a man who barely spoke to anyone, do? The answers were simple and harsh: nothing. He could do nothing. He should do nothing. Jack paid Eleanor, the coins feeling heavy in his palm, and nodded a silent farewell. He carried his sacks out to his horse, the sun glinting off the polished brass of his saddle horn. He secured the supplies with practiced knots, his movements automatic. He glanced one last time towards where Thomas and Lily had disappeared, down the dusty main street towards the outskirts of town. There was no sign of them. He swung himself into the saddle, the familiar leather creaking under his weight. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, but it did nothing to alleviate the peculiar tightness in his chest. He nudged his mare, and they began their journey back towards the silent ridge, leaving the town behind. Jack Wilder had his supplies, and he was returning to the carefully constructed solitude he had built around his grief. Yet a nagging sense of unease about the girl lingered, a faint tremor in his carefully constructed solitude, a discord in the silent symphony of his sorrow. The dust still settled in Jack's mind, not from the road, but from the memory of a small, silent girl. Days had bled into one another on the Silent Ridge Ranch, each sunrise a pale imitation of the last, each sunset a deepening of the solitary ache he carried. He moved through his chores with the practiced rhythm of a man seeking oblivion in labor, mending fences, tending to the few remaining horses in the stables, the scent of pine and dry earth a constant, quiet companion. Yet, the image of Lily Miller, that flicker of vulnerability in Oakhaven, refused to fade. Her thin face, framed by tangled brown hair, would surface unbidden when he poured his morning coffee, the steam momentarily blurring her features before they sharpened again. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself the town had its own struggles, that he had enough grief of his own to manage. The wind, mournful and low through the canyons, often seemed to carry a whisper of Sarah's name, and he would clutch the tarnished silver locket at his chest, its cold metal a familiar comfort against the storm within him. He remembered how Sarah's touch used to chase away the chill, her hands warm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the emptiness that now surrounded him. He was a man who lived by routine, finding a grim solace in its unyielding predictability. But Lily had introduced a discordant note. Her presence, however brief, had cracked open a fragile seam in the carefully constructed wall around his heart, a wall built stone by painful stone after Sarah was gone. He found himself pausing more often, his gaze drifting towards the distant haze that marked Oakhaven on the horizon, the memory of Thomas Miller's rough hand on the girl's arm, the dismissive grunt played repeatedly behind his eyes, a grainy film loop that refused to break. The ranch, once filled with the warmth of Sarah's laughter and the promise of a future, now felt like a tomb. Each plank of wood, each blade of grass, a painful reminder of what he had lost. He had chosen this isolation, believing it was the only way to manage the crushing weight of his sorrow, to protect himself from any further connection that could bring another loss. But the quiet memory of Lily, small and forgotten, was proving to be a persistent burr under the saddle of his carefully guarded indifference. Her unspoken plea, the one he had almost convinced himself he hadn't seen, gnawed at the edges of his peace. He tried to lose himself in the scent of horse leather and saddle soap, to focus on the familiar tasks that demanded his attention. The creak of the barn door, the soft nuzzle of a mare against his hand, the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the rugged hills. These were the only sounds he allowed to pierce his silence. Yet, even as he brushed down his horse, the rhythmic strokes became a counting of the days since he had last seen her, the days since that faint tremor had begun to rattle his solitude. He knew with a certainty that unnerved him that he needed to ride into Oakhaven again, not for supplies this time, but for something less tangible, something he could not yet name. The sun beat down relentlessly as Jack rode into Oakhaven a few days later, the dust clinging to his boots and the brim of his hat. The town seemed a little quieter than usual, the heat stifling the usual midday bustle. He dismounted near the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post, the scent of stale beer and wood smoke hanging heavy in the still air. His eyes, almost without conscious direction, scanned the familiar street, a quiet dread coiling in his gut. Then he saw her. Lily stood by the town well, a small, solitary figure against the weathered wood. Her clothes, if possible, looked even more tattered than before, patched fabric barely holding together, stained with the grime of neglect. A thin, worn rag doll was clutched tightly in her small hands, its single-button eyes staring blankly ahead, a silent companion to her quiet suffering. The sun bleached the color from her tangled brown hair, making it seem almost as faded as the doll's cloth. Jack's breath caught in his chest, a sharp, unwelcome pain. He watched her for a long moment, hidden in the shadow of the general store's awning, his presence unnoticed. She was so small, impossibly small, her frame almost swallowed by the vastness of the dusty street. Her movements were hesitant, her head turning slowly from side to side, her large hazel eyes darting nervously, as if expecting a sudden blow or an angry shout. There was a fragile, watchful quality to her, a constant tension in her shoulders that spoke volumes of a life lived in fear. He noticed the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her cheekbones stood out too sharply beneath her pale skin, a clear sign of hunger. Her fingers, thin and dirty, gripped the doll as if it were the only anchor in her precarious world, a lifeline against an unseen current. The doll itself was a pitiful thing, made from scraps of faded cloth, its stuffing flattened and matted, one arm hanging by a few threads. It was her constant, silent sentinel, a testament to her profound loneliness. A metallic clang echoed as someone inside the general store dropped something, and Lily flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor running through her. She hugged the ragdoll closer, burying her face slightly into its worn fabric, as if seeking comfort from the inanimate object. The simple act pierced through Jack's carefully constructed defenses, a tiny arrow finding its mark. It was not just hunger, he realized. It was a deeper, pervasive fear that had settled into her bones, shaping her every movement. The contrast with his own past, with the vibrant life he had once known, was a brutal lash, a memory, sharp and vivid, unspooled in his mind, bringing with it the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of Sarah's laughter. He was sitting on the porch swing of their ranch house, the evening light painting the world in hues of gold and rose. Sarah stood before him, her auburn hair catching the last rays of the sun, her eyes sparkling with mirth. She was telling him a story about a mischievous coyote that had tried to steal a chicken, her voice a melody that always brought a smile to his face. He remembered the way her head tilted back when she laughed, a full, unrestrained sound that filled the air, dispelling any shadows. Her hand had reached out to lightly touch his arm, a gesture of shared joy, her skin warm against his. He could almost feel the smooth curve of her cheek beneath his palm, the soft brush of her lips against his own, in the quiet aftermath of her story. She had been life, effervescent and full, a constant source of light in his world. Her spirit had been indomitable, her kindness boundless. That memory, so rich and full of life, crashed against the stark reality of Lily's silent suffering, an agonizing counterpoint. Sarah's bright, vibrant presence, her infectious joy, her capacity for love, now existed only in the gilded cage of his memory. Lily, on the other hand, was present, real, in a terrifying reflection of a world without kindness, a world of stark deprivation. The laughter in his memory was loud, overflowing, while Lily by the well offered only a profound, heartbreaking silence. Her small, starved frame, her fearful eyes, the worn rag doll, they screamed of a void where warmth and safety should have been. He felt the familiar knot of grief tighten in his chest, a physical ache that never truly left him. It was a selfish pain he knew rooted in his own loss, but it was also compounded by the sight before him. How could such a chasm exist between the boundless love he had known and the utter neglect that defined this child's existence? The memory of Sarah's words, her gentle nudges to always do the right thing, to extend compassion, echoed faintly in his mind. A distant, insistent bell. He watched as Lily, after a few more nervous glances, tentatively reached for the well pump. Her small hands struggled with the heavy iron handle, her thin arms straining. The effort was visible in her slight frame, the way her shoulders hunched. A few drops of water eventually spluttered out, and she cupped her hands quickly, bringing the meager moisture to her lips. She drank with a desperate urgency, as if fearing the water would vanish before she had her fill, her eyes still scanning the street, wary and vigilant. He imagined the rough texture of the well's rope against her skin, the chill of the water in her cupped hands, the taste of it, perhaps tinged with the dust of the road. Her focused effort, her desperate thirst, made his own throat feel dry. He felt a deep, unsettling disturbance in his carefully maintained detachment, a tremor that shook more than just his solitude. This was not a passing glimpse. This was a sustained observation, allowing the reality of her situation to sink its teeth into him. His gaze lingered on the rag doll once more. It was her only companion, her silent confidant, in a world that offered her little else. The worn fabric, the missing eye, the flattened stuffing, it spoke of countless nights clutched tight, a small shield against loneliness and fear. He wondered if she whispered secrets to it, if it absorbed her tears, if it was the only thing that made her feel less alone. The simple, pathetic toy held a heartbreaking significance, a stark symbol of her isolated existence. Jack felt a wave of anger, cold and sharp, rise within him. Not at Lily, but at the world that allowed such a child to exist in such a state. And then, a colder, more personal anger at himself, for standing by, for allowing his own grief to blind him to the suffering of another. Sarah would have seen her. Sarah would have acted. The thought was a painful accusation twisting in his gut. He knew he should move, should ride away, should return to the safe, quiet confines of his ranch, where the only pain was his own familiar sorrow. But his feet felt rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on Lily. She finished her meager drink, her small hands wiping her mouth, and then she turned, clutching her doll, and began to walk slowly, aimlessly down the street, her gaze still distant, still fearful. She was a ghost child, barely visible, barely heard, yet burning a hole into the fabric of his carefully constructed indifference. He watched until her small figure disappeared around the corner of the blacksmith's shop, swallowed by the harsh sunlight and the indifferent dust of Oakhaven. Only then did Jack push himself away from the wall, his muscles stiff, his heart heavy. He untied his horse, the leather of the reins feeling rough in his hand, a tangible connection to the present moment. He swung himself into the saddle, the familiar creak of the leather a small comfort. He turned his horse and rode out of Oakhaven, leaving the dusty main street behind, leaving the well, leaving the ghost of Lily Miller. But the image of her haunted eyes, those large, expressive hazel eyes that held a plea he could not ignore, and the pathetic, tattered ragdoll she clutched so desperately, rode with him. They were no longer distant figures, they were etched into his mind, a persistent, unwelcome presence that began slowly, insidiously, to chip away at the formidable walls around his heart. The crisp morning air bit at Jack Wilder's cheeks as he rode into Oakhaven, a cold that seeped deeper than his bones, settling right into the hollow of his chest. He had told himself that the return trip was for more lamp oil, for a specific part for the broken fence line on his Silent Ridge ranch. Anything but the real reason his spurs now clicked on the dusty main street. Lily Miller's haunted eyes and the tattered rag doll she clutched so tightly had woven themselves into the fabric of his thoughts, an unwelcome thread in the tapestry of his solitary grief. The image of her thin frame, a ghost of a child moving through the sun-baked town, refused to fade. It felt like a betrayal to Sarah, this flicker of concern for another, yet his conscience, a quiet, persistent whisper, would not be silenced. He dismounted outside the general store, the familiar scent of leather, flour, and coffee barely registering. His gaze swept the street, then the alleyways, a habit born of years on the range, but now sharpened by a new unsettling purpose. He told himself he was merely looking for Thomas Miller, to ensure the man was not causing trouble, to satisfy a morbid curiosity. Yet deep down a different urge stirred, an unacknowledged pull towards the small, silent girl who had disturbed his carefully constructed peace. A flash of faded calico, barely distinguishable against the grimy wood of the general store's back wall, caught his eye. He moved slowly, deliberately, his boots crunching softly on the loose gravel and dried leaves. There, huddled low to the ground, almost swallowed by the shadows cast by the morning sun, was Lily. Her small body trembled visibly, the thin fabric of her dress offering little protection against the chill that still clung to the sheltered corner. Her tangled brown hair, a mess of knots and dust, fell forward, obscuring most of her face. One small, grubby hand held a piece of what looked like old, hard bread, a crust so dry it seemed incapable of yielding nourishment. She brought it slowly to her mouth, gnawing at it with a quiet desperation that twisted something inside Jack. The sound of it, a faint, rasping scrape against her teeth, was almost inaudible, yet it resonated like a thunderclap in the stillness. A wave of cold dread washed over Jack, a familiar chill that echoed the emptiness left by Sarah. But this time it was not for himself. His throat tightened, a constriction that felt like grief, yet it also felt different, sharper, more immediate. He remembered Sarah's gentle hands, always warm, always ready to offer comfort, to bake a fresh loaf, to share a smile. He could almost hear her soft laughter, a sound that had once filled every corner of their ranch house, now only a painful memory that pierced the silence. He thought of the fresh biscuits Eleanor Vance had given him just yesterday, still warm in the paper bag, the ones he had brought back to the ranch and left untouched on his kitchen counter. A foolish waste, he chastised himself, a luxury he rarely indulged in since Sarah's passing. Now, seeing Lily with her stale crust, the untouched biscuits felt like a personal failing, a stark contrast between abundance and utter deprivation. He felt a profound sense of shame, not for himself but for the world that allowed such a small creature to suffer so openly, so silently. He reached into his saddlebag, his movements slow and careful, trying not to make a sound. His fingers closed around the familiar warmth of a biscuit, wrapped in a clean, checkered cloth Eleanor had insisted he take. It smelled faintly of butter and sweet molasses, a stark contrast to the dust and despair hanging around Lily. His heart pounded with a strange mix of apprehension and a nascent, almost terrifying tenderness. This was not his fight. This was not his burden. He repeated the words to himself, a mantra against the tide of rising compassion, yet his hand continued its slow, steady motion. He knew if he paused, if he allowed his mind to conjure another memory of Sarah, he might retreat. He might convince himself that intervening was a slippery slope, a path back to a pain he had tried so hard to bury. So he did not pause. He took a single quiet step forward, his eyes fixed on Lily's small, shaking shoulders. The sound of her shallow breaths was almost lost in the faint morning breeze. With a final, silent movement, he knelt, placing the warm biscuit gently on the dusty ground a few inches from her outstretched hand. He did not speak. He did not meet her eyes. To do so would be to invite connection, to acknowledge the vulnerability that tore at him, to step fully into a role he was not ready to embrace. He simply placed the offering, a silent prayer of comfort, and then, just as quietly, he retreated. He moved behind a stack of empty crates, settling into a position where he could observe, unseen, unheard, a ghost watching another ghost. The waiting felt endless, each ticking second stretching into an eternity. He held his breath, his muscles tensed, an almost physical ache in his chest. Would she see it? Would she be frightened? He watched her, a knot forming in his stomach, a feeling he had not known since those first raw days after Sarah was gone, when every breath felt like a betrayal. Finally, slowly, Lily's head lifted a fraction. Her large hazel eyes, still clouded with a weariness far beyond her years, darted around, suspicious, wary. She saw the biscuit. Her gaze lingered on it for a long moment, as if unsure if it was real, a trick of the light, or perhaps a trap. Jack felt his own heart thump harder against his ribs. He willed her to take it, a silent plea echoing in the empty space around him. Then, with an almost imperceptible tremor, her small hand, still clutching the stale crust, reached out. She touched the warm, soft biscuit, her fingers brushing against its gentle curve. A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps a fleeting moment of hope, crossed her face. She dropped the hard crust, a soft thud on the dirt, and carefully picked up the fresh biscuit. She brought it to her nose, inhaling its sweet, buttery scent, a gesture so innocent, so pure that it brought a fresh wave of unexpected emotion to Jack's own eyes. He felt a stinging behind his eyelids, a sensation he had learned to suppress, a reminder of all he had lost. She took a small bite, then another, her movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every crumb. The biscuit seemed to vanish quickly, a small miracle dissolving into her hunger. She licked her fingers, her eyes still scanning the area, a faint, almost imperceptible easing in her posture. It was a small victory, a brief respite from the harsh reality of her days, and Jack, from his hidden vantage point, felt a strange, fragile lightness settle over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime, a quiet satisfaction that momentarily pushed aside the crushing weight of his own sorrow. But the fragile peace was short-lived. A sudden, rough voice shattered the morning calm, sending a jolt of alarm through Jack. "Lily, you worthless girl, what are you doing loitering back here?" Jack's jaw tightened. It was Thomas Miller, his voice slurred and thick, even in the early hours. The man rounded the corner of the general store, his gaunt face already flushed, his bloodshot eyes darting around with an angry, impatient energy. He reeked of stale whiskey and something else, something sour and unwashed. His perpetually dirty clothes hung loose on his frame, a testament to his neglect of himself and everything around him. He hadn't shaved in days, his beard a patchy mess, and that nervous twitch in his left eye was more pronounced than usual. Lily froze, her small body stiffening instantly, her brief moment of comfort utterly destroyed. She dropped the last crumbs of the biscuit, her head bowing instinctively, a posture of immediate submission. Jack watched, his fists clenching, a cold fire beginning to simmer beneath his ribs. "Get up, you hear me?" Thomas snarled, his voice laced with venom. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached down, his large, rough hand closing around Lily's upper arm, yanking her upright with a brutal force that made her stumble. Her small feet scraped against the ground as she struggled to keep up with his drunken momentum. Thomas pulled her roughly, oblivious to the dusty ground where the biscuit crumbs now lay, oblivious to the small, silent terror in Lily's eyes. He didn't notice the slight warmth that still lingered in the air where Jack had placed his offering. His focus was entirely on his own anger, his own perceived inconvenience. Always lurking, always causing trouble, he muttered, dragging her toward the street, his words a harsh, guttural sound that grated on Jack's ears. Lily made no sound, no cry, no protest. Her head remained bowed, her shoulders hunched, her small form utterly submissive to the man's cruel grip. She simply allowed herself to be pulled along, a silent prisoner in her own world of despair. It was the resignation, the utter lack of fight in her, that struck Jack with a force more potent than any shout or a struggle. Her quiet endurance spoke volumes of a daily horror, a life lived under the shadow of constant threat and neglect. Jack watched her being dragged away, her small feet struggling to keep pace with Thomas's long, angry strides. The image burned itself into his mind. The bowed head, the trembling shoulders, the silent acceptance of her fate. It was a sight so profoundly wrong, so devoid of innocence and hope, that it shattered the last vestiges of his carefully constructed detachment. The cold anger, a feeling he hadn't truly known since the senseless tragedy that took Sarah from him, began to coil in his gut. It was a different kind of fire than his grief, not a dull ache, but a sharp, indignant heat, demanding action. The clink of glasses and the low rumble of voices from the Oakhaven saloon always felt like a mocking echo to Jack's own silence. He pushed through the swinging doors, the smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco hitting him first, a familiar assault on his senses. He needed a moment to himself, a place where he could simply exist without the weight of his own thoughts pressing down quite so hard. The dim light, stained yellow by years of smoke, did little to brighten the mood or the dusty corners. He found an empty stool at the far end of the bar, away from the more boisterous patrons, and ordered a whiskey he had no intention of drinking. His gaze drifted over the rough-hewn tables, the flickering oil lamps, and the faces of men who had seen too much. A conversation drifted from a nearby table, their words a low murmur at first, then growing clearer, cutting through the haze of Jack's own troubled mind. Two weathered old-timers, their faces lined like maps of hard living, were leaning close, their voices hushed but carrying in the quiet lulls. One of them, a man named Silas who sometimes worked at the livery, shook his head slowly. He spoke of Thomas Miller, of how the man had been on a real bender lately, even worse than usual. Silas mentioned seeing him stumbling out of the saloon at all hours, his pockets lighter, his temper shorter. Said he pawned off his wife's wedding band last week. The other man, a prospector named Frank, added, his voice low with a hint of disgust. For another bottle of rot gut, no doubt. Jack felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He thought of Lily, her small, thin frame, her ragged clothes. He pictured Thomas's rough hands, the way he had dragged the girl away. The pieces clicked into place, forming a grim picture he had already suspected. This wasn't just a hard man making bad choices. This was a man actively discarding whatever little he had, including his responsibility. Silas sighed, taking a long swig from his glass. And that poor little thing, Lily? Saw her yesterday sitting out in the dust, clutching that worn-out doll. Looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Jack's hand instinctively tightened around the untouched glass on the bar. His knuckles went white. He could almost feel the rough wood of the doll in his own hand, the cold of it against Lily's small fingers. He remembered the biscuit, abandoned on the ground, and a wave of fresh anger washed over him. It wasn't just neglect, it was a slow, agonizing starvation of spirit and body. The men continued to talk, their conversation a slow drip of grim details, painting a picture of Thomas's relentless spiral and Lily's silent suffering. They spoke of how Thomas would gamble away what little money he earned, leaving nothing for food, nothing for basic necessities. They recounted times when Lily had been left alone for hours, sometimes days, while Thomas disappeared into his drunken stupor. Jack listened, his breath catching in his throat with each new revelation. The air in the saloon, thick with smoke and the faint scent of spilled liquor, suddenly felt suffocating. He felt a burning in his chest, a desperate urge to stand, to shout, to confront these men for their casual acceptance of such cruelty. But he remained still, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He was just another stranger, another man keeping to himself. The shame of his own inaction pressed down on him, heavy and cold. He was just like these men, listening, observing, but doing nothing. Later that afternoon, the sun beat down relentlessly on the main street of Oakhaven, baking the dust to a fine powder that rose with every passing wagon wheel. Jack was making his way back to the livery, his mind still reeling from the saloon gossip when he saw him. Thomas Miller emerged from the rear entrance of the pawn shop, his posture a little straighter than usual, a glint of something in his hand. He was already fumbling with a small cork bottle, his movements eager, almost frantic. Jack, hidden mostly by the shadows of the general store's overhang, watched. He then saw her. Lily sat on an overturned crate just outside the pawn shop, her back against the rough wooden wall. Her head was bowed, her thin shoulders hunched, and the ever-present rag doll was clutched tightly to her chest. Her small, dusty boots barely touched the ground. She was so still, so quiet, like a shadow waiting to be swallowed by the harsh light. The air shimmered with heat, and a fly buzzed lazily around her head, but she did not swat it away. She simply existed, a testament to neglect. Jack felt his stomach clench. He knew what was happening before it fully unfolded. Thomas raised the bottle to his lips, taking a long, greedy swig. His eyes, bloodshot and vacant, scanned the street, searching for something, anything to distract from the bitter taste of his own failure. He did not look at Lily. He did not even glance in her direction. She was merely part of the scenery, an inconvenient fixture. Jack watched Thomas's face, a contorted mask of relief and self-loathing, as the liquor took hold. He thought of the heirloom, the wedding band, the small piece of history Thomas had traded for this fleeting oblivion. It was a betrayal of more than just a possession. It was a betrayal of any lingering hope, any shred of decency. A fresh wave of rage, cold and sharp, cut through Jack. He wanted to stride across the dusty street, to snatch that bottle from Thomas's hand and smash it against the wall. He wanted to shake the man, to scream at him, to demand why he could be so cruelly indifferent to the child who depended on him. But he remained rooted to the spot, a silent observer, his fists clenched, his jaw tightened, the scar above his left eyebrow throbbing faintly. He remembered Sarah's soft hands, her gentle insistence that every living thing deserved kindness, that even the smallest gesture could make a difference. What would she say if she saw this? He imagined her standing beside him, her brow furrowed with concern, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that demanded action. Lily. Lily stirred, her head lifting slightly, her eyes scanning the street without focus. She looked tired, her movements slow, as if each breath required immense effort. Jack saw the faint hunger in her eyes, the hollowness in her small cheeks. He could almost hear her stomach rumble, a silent plea in the oppressive afternoon. His own mouth felt dry, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He felt the heat of the sun on his back, but an icy dread was spreading through his limbs. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. This was stark, undeniable truth, playing out before his very eyes. As Thomas swayed slightly, finishing another swig, he finally turned, his gaze falling on Lily for a brief moment. There was no warmth, no recognition, only a flicker of annoyance, as if she were a persistent fly. He gestured vaguely, muttering something Jack could not quite hear. Lily slowly pushed herself off the crate, her movements stiff, her small legs unsteady. She did not look at Thomas. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, following him like a small, lost shadow. Jack watched them disappear around the corner, Thomas staggering slightly, Lily dutifully trailing behind, swallowed by the dusty street and the indifferent town. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant whinny of a horse and the creak of a wagon. Jack stood there for a long moment, the heat of the sun a physical weight on his shoulders. The image of Lily's bowed head burned into his mind. He walked to the livery, his steps heavy, the grit of the road crunching under his boots. He saddled his horse, his hands moving mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The familiar leather of the saddle felt rough against his palms, the smell of horse and hay a faint comfort, but it did little to ease the turmoil inside him. The ride back to Silent Ridge was a blur of sun-baked earth and familiar landmarks. The wind, usually a welcome companion, seemed to whisper Lily's name. carrying the echo of her silent suffering. Jack felt the weight of his own isolation, the quiet despair of his ranch house, pressing in on him. He had sought refuge here, away from the world and its demands, away from the pain of his loss. But the world, it seemed, had found a way to reach him, to tear at the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He dismounted at the stable, the rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves a steady counterpoint to the chaotic thrumming of his thoughts. The scent of pine from the distant hills usually brought him a sense of peace, but now it felt like a hollow comfort. He led his horse into its stall, running a hand over its warm flank, a momentary connection to something tangible and real. He pulled off the saddle, the leather smelling of sweat and dust, and placed it on its rack. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each action required immense focus to keep his mind from unraveling. Inside the ranch house, the air was cool, almost cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the window panes, illuminating the quiet stillness of the rooms. He walked through the main living area, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He stopped in front of the mantelpiece, his gaze drawn to the faded tintype photograph of Sarah. Her smile was still radiant, her eyes full of the vibrant life he had lost. He picked up the small, tarnished silver locket that lay beside the photograph, its weight familiar in his palm. He often found himself holding it, tracing the worn engravings with his thumb. He clicked it open, revealing Sarah's smiling face inside, forever frozen in time. A wave of profound longing washed over him, a yearning so sharp it felt like a physical ache in his chest. He remembered her laughter, the way her hand felt in his, the sheer joy she brought into his quiet life. He remembered the last time he saw her, her gentle eyes, her last whispered words of love. The memory was a warmth, a comfort, but also a cruel reminder of what he had lost, of the void that had swallowed his world whole. He sat heavily in his favorite armchair, the leather groaning softly under his weight. He held the locket tight, the cool metal pressing into his palm. The contrast between Sarah's warmth, her vibrant life, and Lily's quiet despair was a harsh, unforgiving one. He closed his eyes, and he saw Lily again, her small, vulnerable figure on the crate, her head bowed, her hollow eyes. He heard the casual indifference of the saloon gossip, the clink of the whiskey bottle, the silence of a town that seemed to have turned a blind eye. He had promised himself he would remain detached, that he would not let the world's cruelties touch him again. His grief was a shield, a wall he had built around himself to protect the raw, aching wound of Sarah's loss. But Lily's image, her silent plea, had begun to chip away at that wall, brick by painful brick. He remembered the feeling of indignant anger he had felt earlier, a feeling he hadn't known since Sarah's death. It was a spark, small but persistent, glowing in the darkness of his sorrow. His conscience, long dulled by grief, had awakened with a jolt, demanding his attention. He was a man of principles, a man who believed in doing what was right. But what was right here? To intervene in a situation that was not his own, to invite conflict and danger, or to stand by, a silent witness to a child's suffering? The thought of staying out of it, of letting Lily continue her quiet, desperate existence, made his stomach churn. The image of her small, vulnerable figure, coupled with the town's indifference, makes Jack question how long he can truly remain a bystander. The general store's scent of coffee, wood, and leather usually brought Jack comfort. Not today. Each step across the worn floorboards amplified the hollow ache in his chest, an echo of days of arguments with himself. Lily's vulnerable face, etched with sorrow, clung to him. He tried to shake her image, to lose himself in ranch work, but she persisted, a constant flame in his grief. Eleanor Vance stood behind the counter, arranging tinned goods. Her spectacles sat on her nose, gray hair in a neat bun. Her gnarled hands worked with quiet efficiency. She looked up, a soft smile on her lips, but her observant eyes caught the tension in Jack's posture. "Afternoon, Jack," she said gently. "Just the usual supplies, or is there something else on your mind?" Jack hesitated. The words felt heavy, unfamiliar. He rarely lowered his shield of solitude. Speaking of Lily and Thomas Miller felt like claiming a burden he resisted. Still, the question hung, an invitation he could not ignore. He ran a hand over his chin, his gaze moving to the sun-bleached street outside. "Eleanor," he rumbled, his voice rough. "It's about the Miller girl. Lily." Eleanor's expression shifted, her lips flattened. A shadow of resignation crossed her eyes. She nodded, her hands resting on the counter. Her quiet understanding made Jack's defenses waver. She seemed to have waited for someone to speak. "Lily," Eleanor repeated, her voice softer, weary. "A sad case, that one. Always has been, since her mother passed." Jack felt a jolt of shame, a hot flush spreading. He vaguely knew Lily's circumstances were dire. Hearing it confirmed so plainly from Eleanor, who rarely spoke ill, solidified the truth. He had watched, observed, even given a biscuit, but he had not acted. His inaction felt like a stone in his gut. Her mother, Jack mused. A new piece clicked into place. He had only known Thomas Miller as the town drunk, always with that lost look, now with a small, silent girl. "I didn't know." "She was a good woman," Eleanor said, her gaze distant. "Worked hard, tried her best, but Thomas was always a hard man to hold down. The drink took him something fierce after she left this world." Jack's own grief, a dull throb, stirred at Eleanor's words. He understood how loss could twist a man. He remembered Sarah, her laugh, her hand in his. He thought of Lily, deprived of comfort, withering under a man consumed by demons. The contrast felt unbearable. His own sorrow seemed selfish next to Lily's complete despair. "He neglects her, doesn't he?" Jack asked. It was a desperate plea for affirmation of the truth he denied. "I've seen her. She's too thin, Eleanor. Her clothes, the way he looks at her." Eleanor sighed, a deep breath carrying years of unspoken observations. She walked around the counter, standing closer to Jack, her kind eyes meeting his. The smell of dried herbs drifted between them. "Jack, what you've seen," she said, her voice low, "is only a small part. Thomas has gone beyond neglect. He barely sees her. She is a shadow in his world. He forgets to feed her, to clothe her properly. He forgets she is even there sometimes." A knot tightened in Jack's stomach. He swallowed, tasting dust. He had suspected it, but Eleanor's quiet words struck him hard. He pictured Lily, huddled behind the store, eating stale bread, clutching her worn rag doll. He remembered her blank, resigned eyes as Thomas dragged her away. The guilt intensified, a cold, heavy presence within him. "Does anyone else know?" Jack whispered. He knew the answer. The small town's whispers carried on the wind. Everyone knew. That was the crushing part. Eleanor gave a small, sad shrug. "Everyone knows, Jack. Everyone sees. But what can be done? The sheriff is a good man, but he has his hands full. Thomas is not breaking laws in a way the law here can truly touch. Not yet, anyway." Her words painted communal helplessness, a silent agreement to look away. Jack felt its weight. He was part of that collective shrug, allowing a child to suffer. His solitude, his deep grief made him complicit. He had stood by, watching a child fade. This thought was a bitter pill. His grief felt unique, an island of sorrow, but in his inaction, he was just another face in the crowd. "She needs help, Eleanor," Jack stated with new conviction. The words cut through his pain. He saw Lily's face with agonizing clarity. Her large, hazel eyes held unspoken fear and longing. Eleanor nodded, her gaze softening. "She does, Jack, more than anyone knows. I try to give her a little something when Thomas is not looking. A piece of fruit, a biscuit. But it is not enough. A child needs more than scraps, more than kind words now and then." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "She needs someone, Jack. Someone to stand up for her." His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Helping Lily meant leaving his self-imposed exile. It meant facing Thomas Miller and the town's judgment. It meant new pain, new responsibilities. His ranch, his grief, his memories of Sarah were his sanctuary. Leaving it felt like betraying Sarah's memory, as if moving on would diminish his love. He remembered Sarah's locket, heavy against his chest. He often held it, feeling the cool metal, tracing her faded face. In his darkest moments, he imagined her beside him, her hand on his arm, her soft voice. What would Sarah say now? Would she approve of him hiding, nursing wounds while a child suffered? He knew the answer. Sarah would never have turned a blind eye. She would have been the first to offer help. Thomas is a dangerous man when drunk, Eleanor warned, her voice low. He has a temper. He is desperate. He will not take kindly to anyone meddling, especially not where Lily is concerned. He sees her as his to do with as he pleases. Jack listened, but Eleanor's fear felt distant. The anger from watching Thomas drag Lily away now burned within him. It was a cold anger, unlike Thomas's wild rage. This anger was born of injustice, of a child's suffering. It felt protective, a sensation he had not allowed since Sarah's death. He had locked away at all emotions but grief, believing it the only way. Now a new one forced its way in. The town, Jack murmured, almost lost in the stillness. They will not do anything. No one will. He was not accusing Eleanor, but stating a hard truth of their frontier life. People had their own struggles. The law was often far away. Neighbors rarely interfered in domestic affairs, even when violence erupted. The weight of that collective inaction settled on his shoulders. He had been a part of it, one more silent observer, and the realization brought fresh, sharp guilt. He remembered seeing Lily and Thomas in Oakhaven. People averted their eyes, finished business, moved on. Conversations dropped to murmurs until they were out of earshot. It was not maliciousness, he realized, but fear of involvement. Thomas was known for drunken rage, for his unpredictable nature. People avoided him rather than confront him. So Lily continued to suffer, silently, invisibly, in plain sight. Jack thought of Silent Ridge Ranch, his haven of solitude. The empty fields, the porch swing with Sarah's memory, the quiet house. It was peace, but also a prison of his own making, a gilded cage built of sorrow. He sought to protect himself by withdrawing, but he had become blind to others' pain. Lily's suffering was a harsh mirror, reflecting his self-imposed isolation, his detachment from the world outside his grief. I have tried to talk to him, Eleanor confessed, her voice thick with regret. When I saw Lily ragged or heard her crying, but he curses me, tells me to mind my own business. What good does it do? He is too far gone, Jack. The whiskey has him. Lily just shrinks further into herself. Jack pictured Lily shrinking, a fragile creature retreating. His heart ached, a painful throb different from his grief for Sarah. This was sorrow for a living child, for lost innocence, for a life dismantled by neglect. It was a sorrow that demanded action, not quiet introspection. He felt the familiar pull of his own pain, the comfort of routine grief. It was a known ache. To step into Lily's world would invite chaos, disturbing his delicate balance. It meant confronting Thomas Miller in his own capacity for anger, for responsibility, for a love he thought buried with Sarah. It was a terrifying prospect. But Lily's pleading eyes, flickering for days, became sharper, more insistent. Her eyes were not just fearful. They asked for something, a silent plea that cut through his self-absorption. He had ignored it then, ridden away. The memory had festered, gnawing at his conscience. How much longer could he endure this battle? How much longer could he let a child suffer while he hid behind sorrow? He looked at Eleanor, her face lined with years, her eyes holding compassion and weariness. She had tried. The town had tried or looked away in helplessness, but it was not enough. No one had truly intervened. No one had stepped forward to break the neglect destroying Lily Miller. Eleanor placed a gentle, reassuring hand on his arm, her touch warm. Her eyes held his, unwavering, understanding the struggle within him. Her soft voice carried undeniable weight, a quiet imperative echoing in the stillness. Someone has to do something, Jack, she said. Her words were a quiet challenge, a stark declaration. They cut through the fog of his grief, laying bare the urgent truth. The words resonated deep within him, an unshakable truth piercing his isolation. Someone has to do something. He looked at his calloused hands, a rancher's hands. Could they also protect, bring warmth and food to a freezing, starving child? The question hung heavy, a profound moral conflict washing over him. His grief, a familiar companion, now wrestled fiercely with a nascent responsibility, pulling him in two agonizing directions. The Oak Haven Main Street breathed its usual afternoon rhythm, a slow, dusty pulse beneath the harsh glare of the sun. Jack Wilder moved through it with the measured pace of a man who carried a perpetual weight. He had come into town for a few necessities, items for a life lived alone, but Eleanor Vance's words still echoed in his skull. Someone has to do something, Jack. He had tried to shake them loose, to convince himself that sorrow had earned him the right to stand apart. Yet the image of Lily, small and starved, kept pressing against the carefully constructed walls around his heart. The scent of pine tar from the carpenter's shop mingled with the faint metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge. A dog barked lazily somewhere down an alley. Jack's boots crunched on the dry earth as he walked past the saloon, the faint, tinny piano music a familiar backdrop to the town's indifference. He felt the familiar pull to return to his ranch, to the quiet solitude that had become his only comfort since Sarah had gone. The thought of that peaceful, empty ranch house was a balm, a promise of escape from the complicated world outside. He had come to believe that avoiding entanglement was a form of self-preservation, a way to keep the last fragments of his spirit intact. Then a sudden jarring movement ahead ripped through the mundane tableau. Thomas Miller emerged from the saloon doors, stumbling slightly, his breath already reeking of stale whiskey even from this distance. He wasn't alone. His hand, large and calloused, was clamped around Lily's thin arm. The girl seemed barely tethered to the ground, her small frame swaying precariously as Thomas yanked her forward. His voice, thick and slurred, cut across the street's low hum, a harsh grumble Jack could not quite distinguish. Lily's head was bowed, her tangled brown hair falling across her face like a curtain. She wore the same patched, ill-fitting dress Jack had seen her in countless times. It was faded and threadbare, offering little protection against the harsh elements or the sharper edges of her uncle's anger. Jack felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a tightening in his chest that was too familiar. He stopped, his gaze locked onto the pair, the unconscious act of witnessing. No one else on the street seemed to notice, or perhaps they chose not to. A man adjusted his saddlebags outside the livery. Two women chatted by the dry goods store, their backs turned. The world continued its indifferent spin. Thomas Miller stumbled again, pulling Lily roughly off balance. Her small feet, encased in worn, oversized shoes, struggled to keep pace. She let out a tiny, stifled gasp, a sound so fragile it was almost swallowed by the wind. Her small hands, which had been clutching the worn rag doll tightly against her chest, suddenly flew out to regain her balance. The doll, her only constant companion, slipped from her grasp. It tumbled to the dusty ground, landing face down, its single button eye staring blankly at the earth. Lily made a desperate, aborted movement to retrieve it, a silent plea in her posture. But Thomas, oblivious or simply uncaring, merely tightened his grip and gave another forceful tug. "Come on, you worthless mite," his voice boomed, clearer now, laced with frustration. "We ain't got all day." He was pulling her towards the edge of town, towards the road that led to his dilapidated cabin. Lily stumbled again, her knees buckling slightly, but she remained upright, a testament to a resilience Jack knew she must have honed through endless hardship. Her shoulders were hunched, her head still bowed, as if trying to shrink herself out of existence. Jack felt a burning anger ignite in his gut, a familiar heat that he usually suppressed. This was the indignation that Eleanor Vance had spoken of, the one that screamed for justice. It was an anger that felt almost alien to him now, buried beneath layers of his own profound sorrow. As Thomas continued to drag her, moving with the jerky, unpredictable gait of a drunken man, Lily's small body twisted. Her head, previously hidden, turned slowly. And then her eyes met Jack's. They were large hazel pools, usually downcast or filled with a general, pervasive fear. But in that fleeting instant, they held something else. They were wide with terror, yes, but also with a raw, undeniable desperation. It was a silent, pleading cry, clearer than any shouted word could have been. A plea for help, for rescue, for anything to break the relentless cycle of her suffering. It was a look that seemed to strip away the dust and noise of the street, to cut through the layers of his own protective grief, and plunge directly into his soul. In that single, desperate glance, Jack saw not just Lily, but every painful echo of his own loss. He saw Sarah, her eyes wide and trusting, as he had promised to protect her, to always be there. He saw the gaping void her absence had left in his life, the way he had withdrawn, convinced that to love again, to care again, would only lead to more unbearable pain. The memory of Sarah's bright, living gaze flashed through his mind, a sharp, contrasting image to Lily's haunted stare. He had retreated into his grief, building walls so high and thick that he believed nothing could penetrate them. He thought he had earned that right to isolation, to his quiet despair. But this child, this small, broken thing, had seen something in him, some flicker of humanity he thought he had extinguished. She had sought him out with her eyes, out of all the people on that street, and in that moment he knew he could not look away. A tremor ran through him, a jolt that was both physical and profoundly emotional. It was as if a dam within him had burst, not with a gentle trickle, but with a sudden, overwhelming rush. The grief-hardened resolve, the carefully constructed barrier he had erected around his heart, began to crack. He had told himself he was too broken to help, too consumed by his own sorrow to shoulder another's burden. But Lily's eyes, those desperate, pleading hazel eyes, shattered that illusion. They demanded action, not pity. They demanded courage, not withdrawal. He felt the sting of tears in his own eyes, not for Sarah in that moment, but for the profound, unbearable pain he saw reflected in Lily's. It was a pain he suddenly realized he could not, would not, allow to continue. The main street sounds came rushing back then, the low hum of the town, the creak of wagon wheels. Thomas Miller's slurred curses faded into a distant annoyance. All that remained clear was the image of Lily's face, her small, trembling hands still reaching instinctively for her fallen doll. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness rise within him, a primal urge he hadn't known he still possessed. It was not a gentle emotion. It was raw, unyielding, and absolute. The world shifted on its axis, the familiar landscape of his solitary grief giving way to a new, terrifying, yet undeniably powerful landscape of purpose. His hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles white. In that single, desperate glance, Jack's grief-hardened resolve to remain isolated crumbles, replaced by an undeniable, fierce determination to intervene. The wind whipped past Jack's ears, but he felt none of it. Lily's wide, pleading eyes burned into his mind, clearer than any memory of sunlight. He spurred Rebel, his horse, harder than he had in weeks, a desperate urgency driving them. Those small hazel eyes, reflecting terror and abandonment, eclipsed even the familiar ache in his chest for Sarah. For a startling moment, the world held a stark, immediate demand. The Silent Ridge Ranch, usually a place of quiet sorrow, felt different upon his return. The familiar lines of the main house seemed to blur as he dismounted. His hands moved on their own, uncinching Rebel's saddle, leading him to the trough. The horse's warm breath on his arm was a fleeting anchor, but his mind raced with fear and anger, in a bewildering sense of awakening. He stood for a long moment in the dusty yard as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky. The silence, usually a comfort, now felt like a vast, empty space. A cold, hard resolve settled deep within his bones. This was no longer a question of conscience, no longer a debate with himself under the lonely stars. That single glance from Lily had been a key, turning a lock Jack hadn't known existed. It released emotions he had carefully dammed since Sarah's passing. He walked towards the house, his boots scuffing the worn path, each step deliberate. There was a purpose in his stride, a weight that hadn't been there since he buried his wife. He pushed open the heavy oak door. He moved through the house with a methodical calm. First, the kitchen. He opened the pantry door, its hinges creaking in protest. His gaze swept the shelves, seeing them now as provisions for a small, starving child. He reached for a sack of flour, feeling the fine, soft powder. Biscuits. He could bake biscuits. Sarah had always made the best, light and flaky. A pang of loss, sharp and sudden, pierced through his resolve. But this time, it did not paralyze him. He pulled down a jar of dried apples, their sweet aroma clinging to the air. A slab of cured jerky, dark and firm, followed. Then a small bag of coffee beans, reminding him of Eleanor Vance's words. A comfort, a small warmth. He found a tin of molasses, sticky and thick, and a few precious lumps of dried sugar. Each item on the worn wooden table became a silent promise. His fingers, usually clumsy, carefully selected what would nourish. He imagined her small, thin hands reaching for them, and a fierce, protective instinct swelled within him. Next, blankets. He walked down the silent hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight, towards the linen chest in the spare room. It was a room he rarely entered, filled with ghosts of a future that never was. He lifted the heavy lid, the scent of lavender and cedar filling his nostrils, the faint perfume of Sarah. Inside lay neatly folded quilts and blankets, some handmade by Sarah herself. His eyes fell upon a thick, woolen blanket, deep forest green, woven with pine cones. He remembered Sarah wrapping herself in it on cold winter nights, her laugh echoing in the firelit room. He pulled it out, feeling the coarse texture against his cheek. It still held a faint trace of her scent, a cruel reminder. His hand tightened around the fabric, knuckles white. Grief threatened to consume him again, a familiar, suffocating wave. But then, Lily's desperate, pleading eyes flashed in his mind. He shook his head, a silent battle raging. This blanket, meant for warmth and love, had been folded away, unused. Now it had a new purpose. It would wrap around a child who knew only cold. The thought brought a strange, bitter solace. He carefully folded it, then selected another, a lighter cotton quilt, easier for a small girl to carry. His gaze fell upon a small wooden rocking horse in the corner, dust-covered and still. It had been Sarah's dream, a silent testament to hope shattered. He turned away. The pain was still sharp, but no longer debilitating. Lily needed warmth, food, and safety, not the frozen memory of what could have been. He picked up a small, empty canvas sack from a hook by the door. This would carry his offerings. He moved to his small study, a room lined with books and the scent of leather. He pulled open a hidden desk drawer, the wood groaning softly. Inside lay a worn leather satchel, heavy with the clink of coins. These were his savings, set aside for repairs, for emergencies, for a future he had stopped imagining. He emptied a handful of silver dollars and a few gold pieces into a smaller pouch. The metallic ring was loud in the quiet room. Money. What would money mean to Lily, to Thomas? He knew Thomas would squander it on whiskey, but perhaps it could buy Lily a moment of peace, a warm meal, a measure of safety. He hoped. The weight of the coins in his hand felt less like wealth and more like responsibility. He thought of Thomas, the man's gaunt, angry face, his bloodshot eyes. Confrontation was inevitable. Jack had always avoided trouble, preferring the solitude of his ranch, the quiet rhythm of his work. But this was different. This wasn't about him. A sense of purpose, stronger than his own sorrow, stirred within him. It was not joy, not happiness, but a resolute certainty, a clear direction in a world that had felt aimless for too long. He returned to the kitchen, laying out the chosen items. The flour, jerky, dried fruit, coffee, molasses, sugar, the heavy wool blanket, the soft cotton quilt, the small pouch of coins. He methodically began to pack them into the canvas sack. Each item placed inside felt like a small act of defiance against the despair that had gripped him. He carefully tied the top of the sack, the knots firm, just like his resolve. His mind went back to the moment in Oakhaven, the sun beating down. He remembered watching Thomas yank Lily away, the casual brutality of it. The town had seen it many times and done nothing. He had done nothing until now. Guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth, but it was accompanied by a fierce determination. He thought of Sarah again, her kind eyes, her gentle spirit. She had always been the one to reach out, to offer comfort. He imagined her quiet nod of approval, a ghost of a smile, and the image brought a strange warmth to his chest. Helping another was an affirmation of what she had taught him about compassion. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded and clean, tucked securely into its holster. Not for aggression, he told himself, but for protection. Thomas was unpredictable, fueled by drink and resentment. Jack would need to be ready for anything. He took a long, deep breath, the air filling his lungs, smelling of wood smoke. The familiar weight of his grief was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer the sole occupant of his heart. Something new had taken root, demanding and urgent. He walked back to the stable, the canvas sack slung over his shoulder. Rebel neighed softly as he approached, sensing the shift in his rider's mood. Jack stroked the horse's mane, the soft, warm fur a grounding sensation. He carefully tied the heavy sack to the saddle, securing it firmly. He made sure his water skin was full, his hat settled, his gloves on. Every movement was precise, economical, the way a rancher moved when facing a difficult task. The sun had now dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples that faded quickly into twilight. The air grew cooler, a crispness that hinted at the night to come. Jack swung himself into the saddle, the familiar creak of the leather a comforting sound. He looked back at his ranch, the house dark and silent, a monument to his past. For months it had been his entire world, a place of isolation and mourning. Now he was leaving it behind, not to escape, but to face something greater than himself. His mind felt clear, the fog of incessant sorrow lifting just enough to reveal a path forward. He knew this path would not be easy. It would lead him directly into confrontation, into the unpredictable anger of Thomas Miller. It would lead him into an uncertain future, one where his carefully constructed solitude might shatter completely. But as Rebel turned and began to walk away from the silent ridge, heading towards the faint glow of Oakhaven, Jack knew he had made the only choice he could. The pleading eyes of a small girl had finally broken through the walls he had built around his heart, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The stable hand, old George, rarely looked anyone in the eye. He always kept his gaze fixed on the horses, their hooves, or the dirt beneath his worn boots. Jack approached him by the trough, the scent of wet hay and manure thick in the morning air. "George, you know that Miller fellow?" Jack asked, his voice low, as if discussing the weather. George grunted, splashing water into a bucket. "Thomas Miller? Aye, drunken fool." Jack nodded slowly. "Lives out past the old Willow Creek, doesn't he?" George paused, his gnarled hands gripping the bucket. He squinted at a distant cloud. "Aye, up on the rise there. Little shack, leaning like a tired old man. Can't miss it. Or rather, you can if you ain't looking close enough." He cast a quick sideways glance at Jack, a flicker of understanding in his watery eyes before he returned to his task. The implication hung unspoken. Everyone knew Thomas Miller was trouble, and his cabin was a place to be avoided. Jack felt the weight of that knowledge settle deeper into his bones. The location was confirmed, isolated and dilapidated, just as he had suspected. George's brief, gruff confirmation only solidified the grim picture Jack already held in his mind. Later that evening, back at the Silent Ridge, the vast emptiness of the ranch house felt heavier than usual. The sun dipped below the rugged hills, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. But Jack barely noticed. His mind was a churning storm. He sat in his worn armchair by the cold fireplace, the silence of the room pressing in on him. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind outside seemed to carry a question. He had made a decision. He knew that. But the enormity of it now truly began to sink its teeth into him. Confronting Thomas Miller was one thing. The man was a brute, often fueled by cheap whiskey. Jack could handle a fight, he had handled them before, but this was not just about a punch or a warning. This was about Lily. This was about a small, fragile life. What would he say? How would he even begin? He pictured Thomas's bloodshot eyes, his belligerent stance. The man would likely react with anger, with threats. Jack's stomach tightened. He imagined the words he might use, the arguments, the pleas. None of them felt strong enough, direct enough, to cut through the fog of Thomas's neglect and self-pity. This was a man who saw his own niece as a burden, not a child. Then there was the other part, the commitment. He had prepared the supplies, bundles of blankets, tins of food, a satchel of coins. That was easy enough. But what then? If he took Lily from Thomas, where would she go? To the Silent Ridge? The thought made his breath catch in his throat. This house, his sanctuary, was steeped in the ghost of Sarah. Every beam, every floorboard whispered her name. Could he bring a child, Lily, into that hallowed, sorrowful space? He closed his eyes, seeing Lily's small, pale face, her large, pleading eyes. He saw her clutching the worn rag doll, her only comfort. She was so small, so utterly alone. The image twisted something deep inside him, a protective instinct he had thought long dead. It warred with the deep-seated fear of opening his heart again, of inviting more pain into a life already overflowing with it. His hands clenched into fists, the nails digging into his palms. The air in the room grew cold, even though no window was open. He remembered Sarah's laughter, light and clear, echoing through these very rooms. He remembered her gentle hands, her patience. She had always wanted children. They had spoken of it often, sitting by the same fireplace, dreaming of a future that had been cruelly snatched away. A wave of raw grief washed over him, momentarily eclipsing all other thoughts. His throat tightened, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. He could almost hear her voice, soft and encouraging just beyond his reach. The memory was a double-edged sword. It reminded him of what he had lost, the gaping hole in his existence. But it also reminded him of the love that had once filled this house, the warmth that Sarah had radiated. Could he allow himself to feel that again, even a fraction of it, for another human being? Was it a betrayal of Sarah to let someone else into the desolate landscape of his heart? He stood, pacing the worn rug before the cold hearth. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots. He felt trapped between two impossible choices, letting Lily suffer or risking his own carefully constructed peace. The first option was unthinkable. Lily's eyes had burned that bridge behind him. The second felt like stepping into a raging current, unsure if he possessed the strength to swim. The night deepened, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows through the window panes. He tried to rationalize it, to find a logical escape. Perhaps he could just leave the supplies, anonymously, but that wouldn't solve anything. Thomas would squander them, and Lily would still be trapped. He could try to convince Thomas to send Lily to an orphanage, but his mind recoiled from the idea of her being cast off into another harsh, unfamiliar place. Lily needed kindness, not just survival. She needed a chance. He finally settled back into the armchair, the leather creaking under his weight. His fingers fumbled for the small, tarnished silver locket he always wore beneath his shirt. He pulled it out, the cold metal a familiar comfort against his skin. The clasp was stiff, as always, but he managed to open it, revealing the faded tintype photograph of Sarah. Her smile, even in the sepia tones, was warm and full of life. Her eyes, so kind and intelligent, seemed to look directly into his, understanding all his turmoil. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, the rough texture of the photograph bringing a fresh sting to his eyes. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "Sarah," he whispered, the name a raw plea in the silent room. "What do I do?" He closed his eyes again, picturing her, trying to recall her wisdom, her unwavering moral compass. Sarah would never have turned a blind eye. She would have been the first to offer help, to take in at a lost soul. Her heart was boundless, her compassion fierce. She had always believed in doing what was right, no matter the personal cost. She wouldn't have tolerated neglect, not for a moment. A quiet strength began to bloom within him, pushing back against the fear and the doubt. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming surge, but a slow, steady tide, rising from the depths of his grief. This wasn't about forgetting Sarah, he realized. This was about honoring her, carrying forward the light she had brought into the world. To act with kindness, to protect the innocent, that was the truest testament to her spirit. He felt her presence, not as a source of pain, but as a guiding hand. He felt a deep certainty that Sarah would have wanted him to help Lily. She would have urged him, with that gentle firmness he remembered so well, to put aside his own sorrow for a greater good. It was as if her quiet, loving voice filled the room, dispelling the shadows that had clung to him for so long. The locket felt warmer in his hand now, no longer just a cold reminder of loss, but a conduit to her enduring spirit. The commitment no longer felt like a crushing burden, but a path, a difficult path, yes, fraught with unknowns and potential heartaches, but a path illuminated by Sarah's memory. He was not abandoning his grief. He was transforming it, letting it fuel an act of profound compassion. He was not replacing Sarah. He was expanding his capacity to love, to care because of the love she had instilled in him. He thought of Lily's small, tired frame, the hopelessness in her eyes, and a fierce resolve hardened within him. He would face Thomas Miller. He would ensure Lily's safety. He would do whatever it took. The practical challenges remained. The dangers were still present, but his inner struggle had found its resolution. His conscience had spoken, and it echoed Sarah's unwavering kindness. He spent the rest of the night in quiet preparation. He sharpened his knife, not for violence, but for the clarity of purpose it brought. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded, a necessary precaution in this harsh land. He arranged the supplies in his saddlebags again, making sure they were easily accessible. Each action was deliberate, imbued with a newfound sense of quiet determination. The pre-dawn sky began to lighten, a faint gray bleeding into the deep indigo. The wind had died down, replaced by a crisp, cold stillness. Jack stood by the window, watching the horizon. The first hints of sunrise painted the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and gold. With the coming of the new day, his doubts were truly vanquished. Lily's pleading eyes, burned into his memory, left no room for retreat. He felt ready, his resolve unyielding, a quiet force coursing through his veins. Yet, a subtle apprehension settled over him. It was not fear, not exactly, but an understanding of the precariousness of what he was about to do. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with emotional and physical challenges. He was stepping into the unknown, carrying not only his own burdens, but the hope of a small, forgotten child. As the first rays of the sun touched the peaks of the silent ridge, Jack mounted his horse, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth filling his nostrils, preparing for the confrontation that would change everything. The dusty road unfurled before Jack Wilder, a pale ribbon winding into the fading light. His horse, named Midnight, moved with a steady, rhythmic clip-clop, each hoofbeat resonating in the quiet afternoon. The air, usually crisp with the scent of distant pines, now carried only the dry aroma of parched earth and wilting sagebrush. Jack felt the weight of the supplies in his saddlebags, the metal of the buckles and the tin of the food rations clinking softly with every sway of the horse. This sound was a constant, tangible reminder of his purpose, a counterpoint to the silence that had so long defined his days. He watched the sun begin its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and deep violet. Long skeletal shadows stretched across the landscape, distorting familiar shapes into unfamiliar, looming figures. Each shadow seemed to whisper of the unknown, of the path he was now irrevocably on. The trail, initially a well-worn track leading out of Oakhaven, quickly narrowed into a barely discernible path, overgrown with thorny brush that tugged at his pants and brushed against Midnight's flanks. This was a land less traveled, a place where the earth held its secrets tighter. A prickle of unease ran down Jack's spine, not of physical danger, but of the profound change swelling within him. He had spent years shrouded in a grief so thick it had become his very skin, a protective barrier against the world. Sarah's face, etched in his memory, often appeared in the soft glow of dusk, her kind eyes full of warmth, her smile a beacon he had thought extinguished forever. He would often reach for the locket nestled beneath his shirt, the cool metal of familiar comfort, a tether to the past he could not release. Her memory was a bittersweet ache, a constant companion that had, until now, demanded his entire focus. He remembered her laughter, a clear, bell-like sound that once filled the Silent Ridge Ranch with joy. Now, the ranch was quiet, the joy replaced by the mournful whistle of the wind through empty corrals. He had embraced that silence, cultivated it, believing it to be the only space where his sorrow could breathe. Each morning he would ram, perform his duties with a methodical precision, and then retreat into the quietude, the pain a dull throb beneath the surface. He had told himself that was enough, that surviving was all he could manage. But Lily's eyes, those large hazel orbs filled with a silent, desperate plea, had pierced through the layers of his self-imposed solitude. They were not Sarah's eyes, full of life and love, but they held a raw vulnerability that had ignited something dormant within him. He had seen fear there, deep and unsettling. A hunger not just for food, but for safety, for a gentle touch. The memory of her small, thin frame, clutching that worn rag doll, was a constant loop in his mind, a sharp contrast to the vibrant image of Sarah. This new image, this new pain, demanded action, not just quiet contemplation. He thought of the many times he had turned away, telling himself it was not his concern, that he had no right to interfere. The town had done the same, their collective indifference, a heavy blanket smothering any nascent hope. He had been a part of that, a silent accomplice to her neglect. A wave of shame, hot and stinging, washed over him. He gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles turning white. He imagined Sarah's gentle rebuke, not spoken words, but a knowing glance that would have urged him towards kindness, towards justice she would never have stood by. This journey, then, was not just a ride to a dilapidated cabin. It was a pilgrimage away from the man he had become, the one who sought solace only in sorrow. Each mile midnight covered felt like a fragile step forward, away from the familiar landscape of his grief. It was a new path fraught with unknown dangers, a confrontation with a man known for his volatile temper and his disregard for human decency. Jack felt the familiar clenching in his stomach, the cold dread of an impending fight. But beneath it, a nascent ember of purpose flickered. He imagined Thomas Miller, his face gaunt, eyes bloodshot, reeking of stale whiskey. What words would he use? How would Thomas react to a stranger meddling in his affairs? Jack had prepared for the confrontation, not just with supplies, but with a renewed resolve forged in the fire of Lily's silent plea. He wasn't sure if he could protect her, not fully, not yet, but he knew he could not simply walk away again. That much was clear, stark and unwavering, like the last sliver of sun above the distant peaks. The land grew rougher, the terrain giving way to low, scrubby hills peppered with scraggly mesquite trees. The air grew colder, the wind carrying a dry, biting edge. He pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the dust kicked up by midnight's hooves. The sun now kissed the very edge of the horizon, casting the world in a deep, bruised purple. It was almost evening, the time when shadows truly began to dance and the wild things stirred. This was Thomas Miller's domain, a forgotten corner of the world, mirroring the neglect within. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of Sarah's locket. He did not pull it out, but the touch was enough. A faint warmth spread through his chest, a memory of her unwavering strength, her quiet courage. She had faced hardships with a grace he often marveled at, and in moments of his own weakness, her imagined presence was his anchor. He straightened his shoulders, drawing a deep breath that tasted of dust and cold. This wasn't just for Lily, it was for the man he wanted to be, the man Sarah had always believed he could be. The trail opened slightly, revealing a small, desolate clearing. And then he saw it, Miller's cabin. It was even worse than the descriptions, worse than his own grim imaginings. The structure leaned precariously to one side, like an old man stooping under an unbearable burden. One window was completely broken, gaping like a missing tooth, while another was haphazardly boarded up with planks of splintered wood. The front door hung askew on a single hinge, a dark, yawning maw in the gloom. No smoke rose from the chimney, no inviting glow emanated from within. The cabin was half hidden by a tangle of dead brush and sparse skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the purpling sky. The roof sagged in the middle, its shingles missing in patches, revealing the dark, decaying beams beneath. It looked less like a home and more like a wound on the landscape, a testament to desolation and despair. A chill that had nothing to do with the setting sun snaked its way up Jack's spine. This was the place where a small girl had been forced to exist, where her innocence had withered. He guided Midnight slowly, deliberately, closer to the cabin, each step a heavy thud against the hard earth. The clinking of his saddlebags seemed to echo louder in the profound silence of the clearing. He could hear the wind sighing through the broken window, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of countless lonely nights. A faint, acrid smell, a mixture of stale wood smoke, damp earth, and something indefinable. Something sickly sweet and metallic hung heavy in the air. As he drew nearer, a sound, almost imperceptible at first, drifted from within the cabin. It was a low, slurred murmur, then a louder, coarse word, followed by a clatter. The sound was undeniably human, unmistakably Thomas Miller. It was the sound of neglect, of a life gone wrong spilling out into the twilight. Jack's hand instinctively went to the pistol holstered at his hip. the cold steel a familiar, reassuring weight against his palm. He did not want violence, but he would not shy from it if it meant protecting Lily. Midnight snorted softly, sensing the tension, her ears swiveling nervously. Jack patted her neck, a silent command for calm. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs scattered across the ground. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation. The leaning cabin loomed before him, a dark, silent sentinel of suffering. The faint, unsettling sounds from inside continued, a broken symphony of despair, signaling the imminent confrontation. A tension-filled silence hung in the twilight air, thick and suffocating, waiting for him to make his move. A chill wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, whipped around Jack as he stepped away from his horse. The cabin's skeletal frame groaned under the twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the bleak landscape. A flickering orange light spilled weakly from one cracked pane, painting a shifting, grotesque shadow on the ground before him. Inside, a low, guttural murmur echoed through the flimsy walls, a sound both human and broken. Jack's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his revolver, not in preparation for a draw, but for the solid, familiar weight of it against his palm. It was a grounding presence in this place of disquiet. He moved slowly, deliberately, each boot crunching softly on the scattered gravel and dry weeds leading to the cabin's warped door. The air grew heavier with the stench of stale whiskey and unwashed living, making his stomach clench. He thought of Lily, how this putrid air must have been her constant breath, day after day. A wave of cold fury, sharp and unexpected, passed through him, tightening his jaw. He reached the threshold, the door hanging slightly ajar, its wood splintered and faded. Through the gap, he saw Thomas Miller, a slumped, shapeless form in a rickety chair. An empty whiskey bottle lay overturned on the dirt floor beside him, a dark stain spreading slowly into the grime. Thomas's head lolled to one side, a stream of incoherent muttering escaping his lips. His face, visible in the dim light, was gaunt and shadowed, his beard a matted mess. Jack felt a flicker of grim recognition, a stark contrast to the vivid, painful image of Lily's pleading eyes that still burned in his mind. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, the creak echoing loudly in the suffocating silence. "Miller," Jack said, his voice cutting through the haze of whiskey and despair, calm and clear. He stepped inside, letting the door swaying shut behind him with a soft thud. The sudden intrusion seemed to pierce Thomas's drunken stupor. His head snapped up, eyes bloodshot and unfocused, struggling to discern the figure standing in the doorway. He blinked slowly like a snake emerging from a long sleep. "Who in the blazes? What?" Thomas mumbled, his words thick and slurred. He squinted, trying to bring Jack into focus, a nervous twitch beginning to play beneath his left eye. The smell of him, sour and cloying, seemed to fill the tiny cramped space, making Jack's nostrils sting. "My name is Jack Wilder," he stated, taking another measured step into the room. He kept his hands visible, open, signaling no immediate threat, though the weight of the revolver was still a reassuring pressure against his hip. "I've brought some supplies for Lily." He gestured vaguely toward the heavy saddlebags he had carried in, now placed carefully on the floor beside him. "And I want to talk about her welfare." The mention of Lily's name seemed to ignite a spark of something ugly in Thomas's eyes. His face contorted, a mask of drunken confusion slowly shifting to one of belligerent anger. He began to stir, pushing himself up from the chair with a grunt, swaying precariously on his feet. The chair scraped loudly across the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. "Lily," Thomas spat, his voice rising, a hoarse, ragged sound. "What in tarnation business is Lily of yours, you meddling fool?" He took an unsteady step forward, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "You got no right to be here, nosing around my home, my family." Jack stood his ground, his gaze steady. He saw the rage simmering beneath Thomas's drunken bluster, but he also saw the weakness, the unsteady footing. He had expected this, had prepared for it, yet the sheer force of Thomas's wasted life, the neglect palpable in every dust mote and broken splinter of wood, still hit him with a physical blow. He thought of Sarah, her gentle nature, her unwavering belief in kindness. He remembered the quiet, comforting rustle of her dress as she walked past him, a stark contrast to the squalor surrounding him now. "I've seen how Lily lives, Miller," Jack said, his voice still low but with an edge of steel that cut through Thomas's drunken haze. "She's thin, she's hungry, she's scared. This isn't a home for a child." His eyes swept over the squalid room, the stained walls, the few broken items scattered about, then returned to Thomas's contorted face. Thomas let out a harsh, barking laugh, devoid of any humor. "Scared? Nonsense. She's just a timid little thing, always clinging to that rag doll. She's got a roof over her head, don't she? More than some." He waved a dismissive hand, nearly losing his balance. "And who are you to judge? Some do-gooder trying to stir up trouble? I don't need your charity or your opinions." He stumbled closer, his breath hot and foul. "You think you can just waltz in here, tell me how to raise my own niece? Get out, before I make you regret ever stepping foot on my land." His voice was a slurred snarl, each word laced with venom. He took another wobbly step, his fist clenching and unclenching at his side. Jack felt a cold calm settle over him. He knew this moment, this confrontation, was inevitable. Lily's eyes, full of a desperate, silent plea, flashed before him again, hardening his resolve. He would not back down. Not now. He had come too far, felt too much to turn away from this. "I'm not leaving, Miller," Jack replied, his voice unwavering, a quiet challenge in the oppressive air. "Not until I know Lily is safe." Thomas's eyes, already bloodshot and wild, narrowed to angry slits. His gaunt face flushed a mottled red, a vein throbbing visibly on his temple. The last shred of his drunken self-control seemed to snap. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Safe?" he roared, a sudden explosive sound that made the very air vibrate. "I'll show you safe, you interfering son of a—" His body, propelled by a surge of desperate, drunken fury, lurched forward. Thomas, his eyes blazing with a dangerous, unpredictable fire, lunged clumsily towards Jack, initiating a dangerous and unpredictable standoff. The stale air, thick with the smell of old whiskey and damp wood, rippled with Thomas Miller's clumsy, furious lunge. Jack Wilder did not flinch. His body, hardened by years of ranch work, moved with an almost imperceptible shift. He sidestepped the drunken man, Thomas's outstretched hand grasping only at the empty space where Jack had stood a moment before. The momentum of Thomas's charge carried him forward, his heavy boots stumbling on the uneven floorboards, throwing him off balance. He spun slightly, a garbled curse escaping his lips, before catching himself on the edge of a rickety table, bottles clattering precariously. Jack watched Thomas, his own breathing steady, his hands resting loosely by his sides. There was no aggression in Jack's posture, only a quiet, unyielding readiness. He had come here for a purpose far greater than any brawl. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the grim cabin walls, making the scene feel like a waking nightmare. A thin layer of dust coated everything, and the cold draft from the gaps in the walls bit at Jack's skin, a sharp contrast to the sudden heat of the confrontation. He could hear the rapid thumping of his own heart, a drumbeat of resolve beneath the surface calm. Lily, a tiny figure lost in the oppressive shadows of the far corner, had pressed herself against the rough log wall, her small hands clenched around her worn rag doll, its one remaining eye staring blankly into the room. Her face, usually pale, was now ash-white, drawn tight with a terror that squeezed Jack's chest. He had seen that fear before, in her eyes by the well, behind the general store, but never so raw, so close. The silence in the cabin stretched thin, broken only by Thomas's heavy, wheezing breaths. Thomas turned slowly, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he tried to refocus on Jack. The surprise on his face was palpable, a brief flicker of confusion cutting through the haze of alcohol. He had expected a cowering man, perhaps someone who would back down at the first sign of aggression. Instead, he found only stillness, a quiet strength that seemed to absorb his drunken rage without effort. Jack felt the weight of Thomas's gaze, laced with suspicion and a dawning, unwilling respect for the calm in front of him. He knew this was not a moment for grand words or threats, but for an unwavering presence. "I am not leaving, Thomas," Jack's voice was low, devoid of anger, but it cut through the cabin's oppressive atmosphere with an unexpected sharpness. It carried the resonance of bedrock, a certainty that could not be swayed. "We need to talk about Lily." Each word was carefully placed, like stones set into a foundation, building an argument that Thomas, even in his stupor, could not easily dismiss. Jack watched Thomas's eyes, trying to gauge how much of his meaning truly pierced the alcoholic fog. He understood that this man, lost in his own despair, would cling to any perceived weakness, any hesitation. Jack would give him none. He recalled the burning sensation in his own gut when he saw Lily's pleading eyes, an ache that had eclipsed even the chronic throb of grief for Sarah. That ache had transformed into this steady, quiet fire that now burned within him. He was no longer just a man consumed by his own sorrow. He was an instrument of something greater, a protector. The memory of Sarah's gentle hands, her warm laughter, usually brought a wave of pain, but now it felt like a silent strength flowing through him. She would have approved, he thought, a fleeting private comfort in the chaos. Thomas scoffed, a wet, rattling sound, trying to regain his bluster. He pushed off the table, swaying slightly, his gaze shifting to Lily's hidden corner for a moment, then back to Jack. "Talk? Ain't nothing to talk about. She's my niece. My responsibility." The words were slurred, but the possessiveness in his tone was clear. A fragile claim he desperately wanted to defend. He straightened his shoulders with a visible effort, as if trying to project an authority he did not truly feel. Jack could smell the stale whiskey on his breath from across the small room, a bitter, cloying scent. "Her well-being is everyone's responsibility, Thomas," Jack countered, his voice still even, unhurried. He took a single deliberate step forward, reducing the distance between them just slightly. "Especially when she's starving. Especially when she's left alone in this place." He gestured briefly around the squalid cabin, letting the implication of neglect hang in the air. The words were not an accusation hurled in anger, but a stark statement of fact delivered with the weight of observed truth. He knew that anger would only fuel Thomas's own defensiveness, but quiet truth had a way of seeping in, even through the densest of walls. Lily from her corner made a small, almost inaudible whimper, a sound so soft it might have been the wind. Yet it was enough. It was a pinprick of sound that seemed to sharpen the air, drawing both men's attention. Thomas's head snapped towards the sound, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Jack, however, softened his gaze for a split second, a silent reassurance aimed at the small girl, before hardening it once more on Thomas. He wanted Lily to know, without a doubt, that he was here for her, that she was seen. Thomas's chest heaved. He ran a grimy hand through his unkempt beard, his eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for an escape, or perhaps for another bottle. He had expected an argument, a shouting match, something he could easily win with the sheer volume of his drunken rage. Jack's calm, however, was like a stone wall, unmoving, absorbing every blow without response. It frustrated Thomas, stripping away his usual tactics. He was used to people avoiding his wrath, not standing directly in its path. "You got no business here, Wilder," Thomas growled, his voice a little less confident now, a little more laced with a genuine unease. He took a hesitant step back, away from Jack, away from that unwavering gaze. The heat of his initial fury seemed to be cooling, replaced by a confused apprehension. The thought of what Jack might do, what he might say, began to gnaw at Thomas, pricking at the edges of his drunken haze. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor. This man felt different. Jack held Thomas's gaze, a profound sadness etched around his own eyes, but his jaw was set with absolute resolve. He smelled the faint scent of smoke from the dying fire in the hearth, mingling with the pervasive reek of whiskey. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, a mirror to the cold neglect that had been Lily's constant companion. Every sense was alive to the gravity of the moment, to the delicate balance of power in this wretched room. He knew that for Lily to have any chance, he had to be stronger than Thomas's despair, stronger than his own past grief. "I have every business here, Thomas," Jack stated, his voice a low rumble, steady and deep. "I saw her. I saw what you've done, what you haven't done." He let the words sink in, a quiet indictment that needed no embellishment. The cabin felt smaller, more suffocating, as Jack's presence filled it, pushing back against the shadows of neglect. He could feel Lily's eyes on him, a tiny, hopeful weight, even as she trembled in her corner. That was what truly mattered, that small, fragile hope. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was used to ignoring the whispers, brushing off the occasional glares in town. But Jack Wilder was not whispering. He was standing right in front of him, speaking with an authority that wasn't loud or aggressive, but simply existed, solid and unyielding. The sheer calm in Jack's demeanor was unnerving, an unexpected challenge to Thomas's usual methods of intimidation. Thomas had faced angry men before, but never one so utterly composed, so completely resolute. Jack knew he had to push, but carefully. He was not here to provoke a fight, but to establish an undeniable truth. Lily deserves better, Thomas. She deserves food. She deserves warmth. She deserves care. He spoke slowly, deliberately, giving Thomas no room to misunderstand. Each word was a tiny hammer blow, chipping away at the man's defenses. Jack's gaze did not waver, fixed on Thomas, conveying a depth of purpose that went beyond simple anger. This was about justice, about a child's right to live, not merely to exist. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine, not from the cold, but from the sudden realization that this man would not be easily dismissed. Jack's eyes, usually shadowed by his own sorrow, now held a glint of something powerful, something unbreakable. It was a look that pierced through Thomas's drunken haze, hitting him with a jolt of surprising clarity. The initial bravado, the blustering anger, began to drain from Thomas like water from a sieve. His muscles, tense for a fight, began to slacken almost imperceptibly. Jack saw the shift, the faint flicker of uncertainty in Thomas's eyes. He pressed on, not with a raised voice, but with the quiet intensity that had become his hallmark. I am here to ensure she gets it, one way or another. The unspoken threat hung in the air, not of physical violence, but of an inexorable force, a consequence that Thomas could not outrun or outdrink. The wind howled softly outside, a mournful counterpoint to the tense silence within the cabin, as the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, his tongue thick. He licked his dry lips, his gaze dropping from Jack's, unable to meet the unwavering stare. He felt a cold dread begin to seep into his bones, a feeling he usually drowned with the next bottle. But now, with this man before him, calm as a mountain, the alcohol offered no refuge. Jack's presence was too strong, too real. It was a silent challenge that Thomas, for all his bluster, found himself utterly unprepared to meet. His drunken bravado wavered, leaving him momentarily stunned, the immediate outcome hanging precariously in the balance. The cabin air still hummed with Thomas's drunken fury. A sour smell of stale whiskey and neglect clung to every plank. Jack watched Thomas sway, his eyes now sharp with a protective instinct. He knew hesitation in a drunkard's eyes was a small opening before the bluster returned. Lily remained a still shadow in the corner, her patched dress offering little warmth. Her rag doll was clutched tight, her small fingers white with fear. Her silence was a desperate plea that fueled Jack's resolve. "Thomas," Jack said, his voice firm, "this ends now." His steady gaze held Thomas's bloodshot eyes, forcing a momentary clarity. "I offered help for you both, a way out. You refused it." Jack took a step closer. "You chose to threaten me and raise your hand in front of Lily." The thud of his boots on the floorboards echoed his purpose. Thomas scoffed, a wet sound. "Your way? What is your way, rancher? More meddling?" He gestured wildly, swaying. The nervous twitch in his eye became frantic, betraying his fear. Jack watched his hands tremble, his breath catch. He knew his next words must strike at Thomas's core fear, his squalid, unburdened life. "My way means Lily comes with me," Jack stated. "Tonight. I take her to Oakhaven, to Eleanor Vance. She will be safe there, warm, fed. She will have a bed and a kind face looking out for her." Thomas flinched at the name. Eleanor Vance commanded respect in town. Thomas knew she would not tolerate his neglect. "And tomorrow," Jack continued, his voice low, I go to the sheriff, not just for a talk, Thomas, for an official complaint. Thomas's eyes widen, genuine terror breaking through his haze. The word sheriff hung heavy. Thomas's ashen face paled further in the dim light. His eyes darted, searching for an escape that was not there. His bravado evaporated, leaving him vulnerable. He knew what a sheriff's visit meant, especially with Jack and Eleanor Vance as witnesses. It meant losing his meager freedom, his ability to drift unburdened, which he valued more than anything. The thought of confinement was a terror greater than any guilt. "You can't," Thomas stammered, his voice thin with fear. "She is my kin, my responsibility. Family takes care of family." The words were hollow, a flimsy shield. He clutched the empty whiskey bottle, his fingers white. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, smelling of stale liquor. Jack met his gaze, unyielding. "Your responsibility ended when you chose whiskey over bread, comfort over care. The town sees it. Eleanor sees it. I see it, Thomas." Jack's voice hardened. "The sheriff will also see a child, neglected and starving, living in squalor. He will see the damning evidence of your choices." Jack watched for Thomas's will to break. "You have a choice, Thomas," Jack said. "Let her go with me now, quietly, and avoid jail. Or fight me and face the full force of the law." Thomas's face showed fear and resentment as he weighed the options. The silence stretched, broken by the wind and Thomas's ragged breathing, punctuated by his eye twitch. Thomas's shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him, replaced by defeat. He stared at the floor, breathing raggedly. He muttered curses at his circumstances, at Jack, at his own failure. He lacked the strength to stand against Jack's resolve, with the law threatening him. He was cornered, powerless. Thomas stumbled backward, collapsing onto his rickety stool with a thud. The stool creaked under his weight. He buried his face in his hands, muttering indistinct curses thick with self-pity. His eye twitched violently. The fight left him, replaced by surrender, an admission of failure. Jack knew Thomas was broken by the threat of losing his freedom, not by moral argument. The cabin seemed to swing under his despair. Jack took a slow, deep breath. The immediate danger passed. Exhaustion gave way to determined energy. His eyes flickered to Lily, still huddled in the corner. Her wide hazel eyes watched him, unblinking, her grip on the ragdoll tight. He saw her apprehension, a wariness from years of hardship. Empathy washed over him. Even rescue must feel terrifying to her. He needed to be gentle. He knelt down unhurried, hands open, a gesture of peace. "Lily," he said, his voice soft, a contrast to his tone with Thomas. "It is all right now. You are safe." He offered a gentle smile that reached his eyes, conveying warmth despite his weariness. He slowly reached into his saddlebag, the leather creaking. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, soft and clean, smelling of fresh air. "I brought you something warm," he added, his voice low. Lily's large eyes watched his every move. She did not speak, but her breath hitched. Her grip on the rag doll remained tight, knuckles white. Jack held out the deep blue blanket, letting her choose. Slowly, Lily's small, grimy hand reached out. Her fingers brushed the soft wool, hesitant. Then with a surge of courage, she took the blanket. Her cold fingers touched his, a fleeting connection. He pushed the blanket towards her. "It is soft," he murmured. "It will keep you warm through the night." Lily nodded, her eyes still fixed on him. She unfolded the blanket slowly. The fabric rustled softly. She pulled it around her thin shoulders, the deep blue wool swallowing her small frame. A faint flush of color returned to her pale cheeks, a sign of warmth. A tiny sigh escaped her, a whisper of relief. Jack watched her, a tight knot in his stomach loosening. Quiet satisfaction settled within him. He had reached her. This was only the beginning. He pulled out a small sack of food, fresh bread, dried jerky, and a bright red apple. He placed them beside her, within reach. The sweet scent of bread was a stark contrast to the cabin's stale air. "Are you hungry, Lily?" he asked, his voice low. He knew she must be ravenous. She looked at the food, then hesitantly at him, distrust still in her eyes. But the hunger was undeniable. She nodded, a tiny gesture of acceptance. "Good," Jack said, his heart aching at her quiet admission. He watched her pick up the bread, her small, dirty fingers tearing off a piece. She brought it slowly to her mouth, savoring each bite, her eyes closing in pleasure. It was a simple act, yet intense, a testament to her long deprivation. He realized then the full responsibility he had taken on. This was about rebuilding a shattered world for Lily, a daunting but profoundly right task. He sat back on his heels, observing her, a solid presence. Light from the setting sun cast long shadows, deepening the cabin's oppressive gloom. Outside, the wind whistled mournfully through the walls, a reminder of the cold night ahead. But inside, wrapped in the blue blanket with food in her hands, Lily seemed less fragile, a little more secure. Thomas remained slumped on his stool, occasionally mumbling, a pathetic counterpoint to the scene. Jack ignored him, focusing on Lily. He watched her take another bite of the apple, its red skin a vibrant splash of color. Juice dribbled down her chin, a tiny smile playing on her lips. It was the first time he had seen joy on her face, a sight that stirred a tender ache within him, a sense of purpose and hope he thought buried with Sarah. A quiet understanding passed between them, a silent promise of care. It was communicated through the act of providing warmth and food, Jack's steady gaze and Lily's tentative trust. Jack saw a subtle transformation. Her fear had not vanished, but it was now laced with a fragile hope. Her small shoulders relaxed slightly. She was a child of deep wounds, but the first threads of healing were beginning. He knew this was only the first step on a long journey. He was taking on the task of nurturing a broken spirit, helping her rediscover childhood. He thought of Sarah, her gentle hands, her capacity for love. A pang of grief, familiar and sharp, pierced him, but this time it mingled with purpose. Sarah would have approved, wanted him to extend kindness. Her memory now felt like a guiding light, a source of strength. He had promised warmth and food, and he delivered. He had promised safety, and he would ensure it. Tomorrow he would take her to Eleanor, and they would plan her future. But for tonight, he secured her well-being. He watched her take another bite of the apple, her eyes curious, more peaceful. A profound peace settled over him, a quiet balm to his soul, a promise of a future. Jack could not stay in the cabin all night. The air was thick with Thomas's stupor and neglect. His presence had served its purpose. He had secured Lily's well-being and established a fragile connection. He needed to leave her with a sense of trust to last until morning. The thought of abandoning her, even with Thomas subdued, churned his stomach. He could not uproot her in the bitter cold tonight. He had to be strategic and true to his word. He rose slowly, carefully not to startle her. "I need to go now, Lily," he said, his voice soft, reassuring. Her small shoulders tensed. Fear of abandonment returned to her eyes, clouding her fragile hope. Her tiny mouth, stained with apple juice, trembled. He knelt again, placing a hand gently on her blanket-wrapped shoulder. "I promise," he said, looking into her anxious eyes. "I will be back for you in the morning. As soon as light breaks, I will be here." He wanted his words to be a tether through the lonely hours. "You are safe here tonight, Lily. The blanket will keep you warm. There is more food if you get hungry. Eat as much as you need." He gestured to the remaining food. He pulled out a small satchel of coins and placed it on the table, visible to Thomas. "This is for you, Thomas," he said, his voice flat, "for tonight. Do not touch Lily's food. Not a bite. Understand?" Thomas grunted, lost in self-pity, but Jack knew the implicit threat in the coins would hold until morning. He stood again, his gaze lingering on Lily's hopeful face. Framed by the blanket, her face looked fragile, yet held a flicker of newfound resilience. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging his promise. It was enough. It was a sign of nascent trust, a fragile bloom in the desolate landscape of her young life. Jack walked to the cabin door, his boots crunching softly. He avoided Thomas, who mumbled incoherently. The air was colder now, the night descended, bringing a profound stillness. He reached for the cold, worn handle. He pushed the door open, a gust of crisp night air carrying the scent of pines and damp earth. Before stepping out, he turned for one last look. Lily was still there, wrapped in the deep blue blanket. As his eyes met hers, she lifted a tiny hand, clutching her rag doll, and gave him a small, hesitant wave. It was a simple, profound gesture. It was a wave of hope, replacing the agonizing image of her pleading eyes from yesterday. That plea had spurred him to action. This small wave confirmed the rightness of his choice, the impact of his intervention. It was the first true gesture of connection, a bridge between their wounded souls. Jack felt a profound shift within him. The suffocating shroud of grief seemed to lift, allowing a tiny breath of fresh air. The ache for Sarah would always remain, an indelible mark, but now it came with a new vital sense of purpose. A glimmer of peace, a quiet warmth, spread through his chest, thawing the ice around his heart. This renewed direction pulled him forward, away from sorrow, towards a future with meaning. He stepped out into the cold night, pulling the door shut softly. The air was sharp, invigorating, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The moon, a thin crescent, hung high in the inky sky, casting long, ethereal shadows. The stars were brilliant. He untied his horse, mounted it, and turned its head towards Silent Ridge. The ride would be long, the trail dark, but the darkness no longer felt oppressive. His horse's hooves clattered softly on the path. Jack rode in silence, his mind alight. He thought of Lily's desperate plea, her clutching the doll, her hunger. He thought of Thomas, pathetic and defeated. Then he thought of Sarah, her image clearer, less shrouded in pain. Her warmth was a guiding memory. He imagined her soft encouragement, telling him this was the path of compassion she would have wanted. The locket, usually a source of sorrow, now felt warm against his chest, a symbol of enduring love. He had spent months adrift in grief, his ranch a prison. He had pushed everyone away, convinced opening his heart would bring more pain. But Lily, this small broken child with a single glance, chipped away the walls around his heart. She showed him that even in despair, hope flickered, a desperate need for connection. He realized his intervention, driven by a moral imperative, was also an act of self-preservation. In saving Lily, he was, in an unexpected way, saving a part of himself, rekindling a flame. The wind sighed through the canyons, a mournful sound. It no longer echoed his internal wail. Instead, it felt like a cleansing breath, sweeping away the cobwebs of his sorrow. The stars shone brighter, the air tasted sweeter. The vast, open west now held the promise of a future. It was a future woven with responsibility, compassion, and nascent hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer alone in his heart, no longer trapped in the past. He carried Lily's tiny wave, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder that kindness could change everything. For the first time in a long time, Jack Wilder felt a glimmer of peace. It was a quiet, enduring calm, a gentle hum of purpose that resonated deep within his soul. He had found a new direction, a path that promised healing for Lily and for himself. The crushing weight on his shoulders had shifted, now the lighter weight of responsibility and a burgeoning hope.